I am going to say that this is going to be on World War II, right? So we did our interwar period on the take-home quiz that you guys took. So this is going to be really all just World War II information. So for starters, I think you guys hopefully saw in Google Classroom that I actually created a Quizlet for you. So I just put that on the screen right here. There is a link to it in Classroom. So there's about 33 terms here that you guys can take a look at. That'll help you hopefully with your studying. I don't know if you ever used Quizlet before, but it's basically just online flashcards. You got Adolf Hitler, obviously the dictator of Germany. There's a picture of him. You got Stalin, communist dictator of the Soviet Union, and so on and so on. All right, so you can use those to help you study after this tonight. So there's one thing else that's cool is you can do like a test. So if you wanted to, you can kind of like test yourself with some of these things based off of the flashcards anyway. You could also play some games if you never used it, right? So you can do some matching. Gonna make sure everything disappears. So we gotta do George Marshall. You guys can see how you basically just line it up, right? So there we go. The United Nations is probably right there. Pearl Harbor's right there. Efforts of reconstruction in Japan, and so on and so on. Okay, so you can play these games as much as you want to help you study, and that'll be pretty good, I think. So let's go back here. We're going to do a quick run through of most of the information again for you guys here tonight. I know it's been a little disjointed as far as the notes. I know you guys wrote a bunch down. Plus we've given you guided notes for one or two little sections here. So we'll kind of run through what you should know. I might use a little bit different notes than what we used in class too, so sorry for the confusion. It's just how I kind of organize things to be able to kind of talk things through elsewhere. So let's look at this all while we get going here. Let me get the first things up. So if you remember, the first thing we did is actually in Classroom. So Mrs. Kipperman talked about, let me go down to it. She talked about the fall of France and appeasement and all of those things. I copied those notes directly into Classroom for you, word for word, that what she wrote down on the board in class here. For you guys, I'm going to kind of now shift over to a different PowerPoint that kind of runs through these things just because it's easier for me to talk about it, showing pictures and things like that. Okay, so let me bring that up here quick. Alright, so first off, we should run through the dictators, right? All the different people. Are there closed captions? I might be able to try to do closed captions. Let's see how well this is going to work. It looks like it works well, actually. So let's do that. While I'm in slides anyway, I can have these closed captions going. So first things we have here is Benito Mussolini, right? So Benito Mussolini was the dictator in Italy. He's going to be leading the fascist party, right? We went all over this. These people, could show up again for sure here, so be ready for them. Okay, so you got Emperor Hirohito. He's the Emperor of Japan, obviously. He is kind of seen as this divine figure to the Japanese people, right? Kind of seen as this godlike figure, and essentially, he is going to be partially responsible for the extremely nationalistic policies that Japan is going to push and their imperialistic policies that they're going to be implementing going into and invading Korea and invading into China and Manchuria, right? We talked about all those different terrible things that the Japanese did in China, which I'll show you a picture in a second here, right? We also have Hideki Tojo, who is kind of the military leader and will actually also become the Prime Minister of Japan during World War II here. He's going to be largely responsible for Pearl Harbor and the attack there, and also some of the things that they were doing in China, like the invasion and rape of Nanking here. So you should familiarize yourself with that. You have Adolf Hitler, who is the leader of Germany, right? He's obviously a authoritarian, dictatorial person here in Germany, the leader of the Nazi Party in Germany, right? We talked about the wave and all of these different things of how these people were able to influence the regular people in Germany to get to the power that they had, right? Hitler was appointed by an elected official, right? So he was brought into the government based off of the parliamentary system, and eventually took power and seized power in emergency actions in Germany in the early 1930s. So here's another one of these rallies in Nuremberg, right? You have hundreds of thousands of these people that are getting involved, right? So we have Joseph Stalin, who is the leader of the Soviet Union. He's another dictatorial figure, leader of the Communist Party here in Russia, in the Soviet Union. Sorry, it's not Russia at this point. The Russia is just one of the really the largest entity in the Soviet Union, but it is still it is the Soviet Union, right? So we know that this party, if you will, is going to be kicked off. The start of World War II is with the invasion of Poland, right? We also know that the Soviets had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany prior to the war, prior to Germany doing this, right? You're going to have Germany invading Poland on September 1st, 1939 in their Blitzkrieg attacks, right? You have Blitzkrieg meaning kind of lightning war, right? They're going to push in with their air support, their Luftwaffe, the tanks, the infantry, right? And they're just it's going to be a real fast push. That's why it's extremely overwhelming to the defense that aren't ready for it. So with that, you're going to get this kicked off, right? So from there, you're going to kind of have a little bit of a lull, actually. The Soviet Union is going to kind of come in from the east, and Germany's going to come in from the west, and ultimately, there's going to be a little bit of a lull in the war until Germany is going to now invade France again, right? And they're going to do that and push through Belgium, avoiding the French Maginot Line, which we also talked about, right? So you're going to have that, right? So the French Maginot Line was these defensive fortifications that you should be aware of anyway, that the French had pushed kind of along the German border. They didn't fortify as heavily along Belgium here because, well, Belgium is not Germany, right? So they didn't have to worry as much, they thought. They did have fortifications and less of a line, but it just wasn't ready for the Germans to push through Belgium where they did. They didn't think it was actually really possible, or that they wouldn't be able to move that quickly and that they would be able to allocate resources elsewhere and bring them up if the Germans were attacking. So they were wrong, and the Germans pushed through with their blitzkrieg tactics into northern France through Belgium. You're going to have the Battle for France, and it's not going to go particularly well for the French. They're going to fall pretty rapidly here. You're going to have the evacuations at Dunkirk, which I guess even days they saw the movie, and then we'll finish it up in class here. There really aren't going to be, there might be a couple people questions, but as far as the cards go, that's going to be the predominant thing. So I think the Quizlet's there. You should still know who these people are, because there could be questions related to them and not necessarily who the people are, but actions of these people. So you should familiarize yourself with the people for sure still, either way. So anyway, you have the German Blitzkrieg attack, right? You're going to have this full evacuation of the Allied forces on the continent to England through Dunkirk, and you're going to get a puppet government installed in France by Hitler and the Nazi Party, known as Vichy France. And you're going to have French resistance too. You should not forget that as well. Okay, so your next thing you need to really know about is the Battle of Britain, right? The Battle of Britain is the natural continuation. I guess this isn't really a great map here, but when Germany is going to now hit the coast, they have the English Channel, and they obviously can't invade England, at least by land. So they are going to attack it, right? They're going to attack it with their Luftwaffe, their Air Force, and it's going to be kind of devastating in England and London for a bit, right? You're going to have entire neighborhoods that are bombed. Civilians are going to be killed. I showed you some pictures in class. It's going to hope to break the British morale here of the invasion. You're going to have the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He's going to kind of really rally the British people, and that's going to be really important, right? And the actions of the Royal Air Force are going to do really, really well in repelling the German Luftwaffe, and it's going, effectively, this effort is going to increase the morale of Britain by stemming off this attack, right? But also it's going to keep Germany out of full control of Western Europe here with it, keeping them out of England, right? So I showed you some pictures here, right? You got the contrails above Big Ben. You get the little girl outside with her doll in these destroyed neighborhoods in London. Some of these images were propaganda we talked about as well, so you can take a look at those again if you want. So the next thing we talked about is Operation Barbarossa, right? Operation Barbarossa now is the Germans pushing eastward, right? They're going to kind of stop their pact with the Soviet Union. They're going to invade the Soviet Union, and this is going to be the largest part of the war, really. It's as far as the most forces committed and some of the largest engagements and amount of people and tanks and military resources. This is going to be a bulk of the fighting. So it's really a pretty important thing to know about. It's going to be a pretty long war of attrition. Germany's going to attack. It's going to kind of get into the winter. It's not going to be good for either side. Yeah, so here's the initial attack. Operation Barbarossa is going to spread into the Soviet Union from eastern Poland there. Joseph Stalin kind of doesn't want to believe that it's happening. He didn't think it was going to, but it does, and it overwhelms them a bit early on here. They weren't quite ready for it. And it stems from this idea that the Nazis wanted to acquire the oil reserves in the Caucasus as a big part of it, but largely also that they needed this land now to basically take it, get rid of these people that lived there, and repopulate it with their Germans, right? They're repopulating with the Germanic people here, and if that meant killing these Slavic peoples and the other, Soviet peoples there, that's what it meant, right? And it's going to lead to some pretty harsh mistreatment of the Russians as the Germans headed eastward, right? I read you these quotes. Don't worry about them. These numbers aren't that big of a deal, but they just to show you the scope and scale of things, right? All right, so real quickly, too, I'm going to skip some of this stuff. This is not something we really talked about too much. But anyway, we did talk about D-Day, right? So let's kind of get into that a little bit. So D-Day is important because it's when the Allies are going to kind of push into Europe, right, specifically. They actually do come in from North Africa before that. That's all you really need to know, that the Allies, the initial fighting does happen in Northern Africa and go up into Italy. And when they break into Italy and take Rome, it's essentially the exact same time that D-Day is occurring. And D-Day is trying to break through what's called the Atlantic Wall. Okay, so the Atlantic Wall are these defensive fortifications that the Nazis build along the Atlantic coast, where they believe that the Allies in Great Britain will try to push into France, right? So where these green lines are, they basically build up the coast with these fortifications and barbed wire and what's called hedgehogs. These things that are going to prevent ships from essentially landing on the coast. And that's what they try, right? But when D-Day happens, anyway, there's a lot of misinformation that the Allies push out. They kind of trick the Nazis of where they're going to be attacking, which is kind of helpful for them. And ultimately, they send amphibious assaults, right? They use paratroopers first, which some of us watched with the Band of Brothers, right? And then they also used the amphibious transport vehicles here, right, where they are going to land on the beaches of Normandy, right? So this whole thing is led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, right? It's directed by him. He's the supreme Allied commander here. They land on 5 separate beaches in Normandy, depending on which nationality you are. If you're American or Canadian or British, depends on the beach where you're going to land, and they attack, right? It's one of the largest military operations in history, for sure. And it's known as D-Day. The official military classification was Operation Overlord, and it occurs on June 6th, 1944. I really like this picture here. This picture really sums up how large of a scale this actually was, right? It's pretty, look at all these vehicles and ships. It would really be a pretty impressive sight in person, for sure. So it's a pretty bloody day, obviously, but the Allies do win, right? They break into Normandy, they break the Atlantic Wall, and they are able to get their troops and their supplies and their armor and their vehicles and artillery and things on shore. And this is where you're going to get the rest of the fighting going on here in Europe. So we have the paratroopers that we saw in Band of Brothers, for sure. There's 2 great movies that we've kind of mentioned in class. You have Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan that really do a great job at showing the break-in in Normandy and some of the rest of World War II campaigns. So don't worry about this too much. We did talk about the fire bombings that are going on, right? But let's kind of break. I'm going to pause here for a second. We're going to talk about the Pacific War here. So let me find that slide deck here. Give me 1 second, sorry. So it's a little easier sometimes to kind of talk about the Atlantic War, right, versus the Pacific War, and so we're going to kind of be jumping around in time a little bit here. So sorry about that a little bit, right? So we know that the Japanese imperialism in China, right? Talk about the Nanking Massacre. While all this is going on, we know also that you're going to have Pearl Harbor happen, right? And that's largely because the Americans kind of cut off Japan from a lot of the resources that they needed to fund their industrial war machine in China. The Japanese weren't particularly happy and thrilled about that, so their response is to attack the United States, right? And they do. They attack us at one of our territories at the time, Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. It was not a state, it was a territory, and it's a big naval base there at Pearl Harbor is where they attack, right? So they do, but they also attack a lot of other places, okay? So in the same vein, right, and more or less the same day, they attack at Wake Island and Guam. They also move into Thailand and Hong Kong and eventually into the Philippines in mid-December, okay? So the Pacific Front is very different than the Atlantic Theater, right? And that's largely because the Pacific Ocean is a huge, huge ocean. It's enormous, right? I think this picture really kind of sums up how large the Pacific Ocean is. You can almost get entirely just the Pacific Ocean in one satellite image here. It's enormous. You got Hawaii right there, right? So as far as people you need to be familiar with, again, right? We're not gonna really ask too many questions about the people directly, but you should familiarize yourself with Douglas MacArthur. He is in charge of the Allied military in the Pacific Front. He was stationed in the Philippines before he's going to get kind of forced out. Okay, so you're also just not so much tested on, but just again, because some of us talked about it, depending on who did this particular set of notes, me or Mrs. Kipperman. But you're going to have the Philippines and the Japanese attacking in the Philippines. We had Americans stationed there, and they're going to do some pretty terrible things on these death marches, the Bataan Death March it's called, of Japanese and American and Filipino soldiers. And you have some propaganda here trying to get Americans riled up to get them into the war, right? So don't worry about that too much. So as far as island hopping, something that you do need to familiarize yourself with is this island hopping idea, right? Where you got a map, where is it? So we have basically the islands in the Pacific, right? And in order to get to Japan, what's going to happen is you need to go from island to island, and the Japanese had occupied a number of these islands, right? That's a pretty big deal. So we need to go from island to island and jump from island to island in order to and basically get rid of the Japanese there before we can kind of keep pushing closer and closer to Japan. And the Japanese enemy is a really fearsome enemy, and it's pretty difficult for them to fight because they kind of fight to the end, right? And they're willing to fight all the way. They're not willing to surrender. It's just really tough to fight them for sure. So we have this island hopping strategy to get closer and closer until we get to the point where we're able to fight. Sorry, these are just some stuff that's... So anyway, we talked about the Japanese firebombing a bit as well, right? So as we get closer and closer in our island hopping strategy, we get closer to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which are closer. We have our big bombing campaigns of Japan at that point. You have these big firebombing where killing hundreds of thousands of people in Japan that were not military personnel, right? But that's just part of what was going on. It was just kind of the way the war was being fought at this point, and trying to end the war. This was what we were perpetrating, right? So this image really is cool. It kind of shows you how much of these cities were actually destroyed. So Tokyo, which was relatively in comparison to New York as far as size, roughly 40% of the city was destroyed in firebombing by the Allies. You have Nagoya, I might be saying that wrong, but 40%, which is the size of Los Angeles, right? You have these cities in Japan mostly made of wood. So the fire bombs, these incendiary bombs, really light things on fire, and it kills a number of people. So as we get closer and closer, right, we're going to have President Roosevelt, who was the American president at the time. He's going to die April 12th, 1945. You're going to have a man named Harry Truman become the president after that, and he is going to be the one that okays the dropping of the atomic bombs, right? So the dropping of atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You're going to get the VJ Day, it's called. So victory in Japan after we won in Europe. Anyway, this picture is about 15-20 minutes after the drop bomb, right? This is Atomic Cloud, and I re-looked at my source for this, and this is a credible image. I thought it might have been kind of fabricated for propaganda purposes when I was something that I just remembered reading at some point, but I guess I re-looked at it and I was kind of wrong, so that's pretty cool that this image is pretty serious. So it kind of shows the atomic cloud after the fact. This really shows Hiroshima before after the bomb, right? You can see the utter sheer devastation of these weapons, right? We talked about some of the justifications of the bomb, whether or not it was justified, why people would argue that it would be, and why others would argue that it wouldn't be. So you don't necessarily need to remember that, but I'm just kind of saying that we talked about it, right? So as far as VJ Day, we're going to have unconditional surrender now by the Japanese. And ultimately, World War II comes to a close, right, with about 40 to 60 million people dead worldwide, right? It's pretty serious. There's a really great video. I wish maybe we'll watch it after our test, but it's in here, and I actually posted it to Google Classroom. It's called World War II by the Numbers. It's about 20 minutes, but it does a really great job at kind of showing the numbers and how they stack up and things. It's really, really interesting. It's done very well. So maybe you should watch that afterwards if you're on a World War II kick here. Okay, so getting down to the end here, let me find back to where I was. All right, let me bring this up. Sorry, a little disjointed here tonight. So Mrs. Kipperman talked about the peace and its consequences of World War II, right? So let me bring that up. But before I do, let me come up with an extra credit question. Actually, I got the extra credit question. So my extra credit question is that I am going to be going away for spring break. So the question is going to be, where am I going? And the answer is going to be Hawaii. So if you have that answer for the test, then I guess you will get an extra credit point. Okay, so now moving on to peace and its consequences here. Right, we know the war ends. Germany surrenders on May 8th, 1945, which is VE Day. VJ Day is going to be August 15th, 1945, after we drop the atomic bombs, right? So the war continues on after we beat the Nazis, right? So the victors are going to be holding what's called war crime trials, right? And there are war crime trials for the Japanese, and there are war crime trials for the Nuremberg, the Germans, and the Nazis. You're going to have much more, I guess, punishment for the Germans and the Nazis than some of the officials of the Japanese. While the numbers are there, we're much easier on the Japanese for some reason than the Nazis. So we have the famous kiss here on VE Day, when the war, no, this is VJ Day, I believe, in Times Square. So anyway, as far as the outcomes, right, there are going to, I don't know if I'm going to get to Pearl Harbor, actually, Dakota, but I might be able to try to make it happen. So anyway, so as far as the outcomes, right, there are going to be creation of kind of two superpowers now at the end of World War II. You're going to have the United States, and you're going to have the Soviet Union, right? And what had happened is, as the Soviet Union had kind of pushed back into Europe, right, and taken part of Germany during the end of World War II here, after the Germans failed to kind of beat them, you're going to have now this dividing line between communism and the Western democratic and capitalistic countries, right? So this dividing line is going to get dubbed an Iron Curtain by Winston Churchill post-war, and you're going to have Eastern European countries that have fallen under this communistic control, right? And this is going to kind of be the start of what we call the Cold War, right? So the Iron Curtain would be kind of right down here in the middle here, down this white line. So it gets tricky, right? Because the thing is communism is promising a whole bunch of things. It's promising jobs, it's promising housing, it's promising food, right, for all of these people, and ultimately this sounds rather enticing to a lot of people in Western Europe as well, right, who's maybe had much of their homes and their towns and their villages destroyed by the war. So this is kind of rather enticing. So this is going to kind of be the offer of communism, and the Allies are going to have to kind of combat that a little bit. We're going to talk about that in a second, right? So you're going to have the formation of international cooperative organizations as well, right? We have the United Nations, which is going to be formed in 1945. It's going to replace the League of Nations, right? You're also going to have the NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is kind of this treaty organization of Western countries that if communist countries attacked any of these, it's going to be kind of set in motion that all of these groups will come together and fight on behalf of the others, right? And in similar vein, the communists are going to kind of create their own. It's going to be the Warsaw Pact in response to NATO. So all these communist bloc countries are going to have the same kind of deal, that if for some reason there's an aggression from the NATO countries, then they're all going to kind of kick in and help each other too. You're also going to have the publishing and the acceptance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by a number of the United Nations countries. It's going to try to provide a code of conduct for the treatment of people under the protection of their government, right? And you can kind of read parts of it right there. So members of the Warsaw Pact, you're going to have Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, to name a few. We're not going to necessarily make you know or remember all of those, okay? So as far as NATO countries, this list is a little harder to read here, but you're going to have Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, United Kingdom, and the United States. Greece and Turkey are going to become members a bit later, and also West Germany and Spain as well later on in this, okay? So, as I was saying a minute or two ago, as communism is looking fairly appealing and attractive to some of these Western European countries that had been kind of broken and destroyed by much of the fighting of World War II, the United States is going to take it unto themselves to kind of implement a rebuilding of Western Europe, kind of trying to prevent the spread of communism, right? And this is going to be known as the Marshall Plan for George C. Marshall, who is the general during World War II, and he is going to kind of be the implementer of this plan. He's also, I believe, the Secretary of State following the war. Let me double check on that. Oops, wrong. I'm going to go over here. Yes, he served as Secretary of State for Truman, so I was right. Served as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense under Truman. Look at that. Anyway, okay, so you have that, right? So you're going to also have efforts of reconstruction in Germany. So Germany, did I lose my, I lost something here on my screen, sorry. I want to get that back before I go any farther here. There I am. Okay, so anyway, I just lost you though. So there we go. So Germany is going to be divided up right after the war, and it's going to have kind of the Allied zone and the Communist zone of Germany here, right? So the Allied zone is going to be kind of broken up into three sections, sorry, the French, the British, and the American sections, where you're going to also have the Soviet section of East Berlin. It's a little tricky because Berlin is situated within Eastern Germany, right? So it's situated within the Soviet bloc. It's situated behind the Iron Curtain, and this causes some serious friction during the Cold War, which we'll probably talk about not too far in the future, right? But that's going to be kind of the division there. Western Germany is going to be democratic, right? Eastern Germany is not going to be. It's going to be occupied by the Soviet Union, right? There's a great movie. It's called Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks. That does a really good job showing that as well. Some of the differences between West and East Berlin and Eastern Germany and such, right? So it sits here. Berlin is well into the Soviet zone, and that causes lots of problems during the Cold War. So anyway, as we kind of just said, okay, so here we go. As far as the last bit here, as far as efforts of reconstruction of Japan, Japan is going to be under occupation by the United States under General MacArthur and MacArthur's administration. Okay, U.S. is going to kind of ensure democracy and economic development of Japan, and it's going to kind of get rid of the offensive military capabilities of the Japanese, and it's also going to not really allow the Japanese to have a military. And in doing that, the United States is going to basically guarantee Japan's security as a result. So partially, we know that Japan today is a pretty dominant economic figure, powerhouse in Asia, right? And that's going to be pretty big, right? So the fact that America kind of guarantees Japan's security as a result of these post-World War II treaties, it's going to allow them to kind of focus completely on the economics and their own country. It's going to allow them to really rebuild pretty rapidly following the war. So anyway, that's kind of it. So remember that we have your Quizlet that you can help study a bit. That does a pretty good job, I think, of running through a large part of the material anyway. I'm sure there's something I forgot in there as I was making it. But anyway, okay. If there are any last questions, please throw them into the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to get going, and I'll leave you guys to your studying here. Okay? 30 more seconds. Alright guys, if there's no more